on behalf of the AA to very warmly welcome Catherine Ingraham to the school. And it's very difficult. I know that most of you are familiar with Catherine, but it's very difficult to give a kind of very kind of precise description of what Catherine is, because she's a dedicated thinker and writer. At the same time, she's a committed educator, and something very rare, she's also a design professor without being an architect. I keep on discovering aspects of her life, and she was trained initially as a philosopher. But right now she teaches at the Pratt Institute of New York, and she's in the graduate architecture program, a program which she chaired for several years, and in one way she developed. And of course, she has taught and lectured and given seminars in many institutions, including Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and of course the AA. But as I said, Catherine is also a prolific writer and has published widely, and the most well-known writings of her are the book Architecture and the Burdens of Linearity, which she published in 1998, and her most recent book is has the kind of the title of Animal Architecture, Human, Asymmetrical Condition, which was published last year and which Catherine introduced to the AA 2 years ago. And as I think reflecting her personality, I think her work also is a kind of, or reminds me of a kind of cut through a vast field of knowledge. And I would not be able to summarize the kind of the field of study in her last book, but I could say that she takes that kind of very familiar relation in both the discipline and the practice of architecture between a space and life. And in one way, she tries to redefine that in a kind of different terms, and especially through the idea of biological life and how biological life, and of course, you may correct me if you want, how biological life, the idea and the history of the idea of biological life bears on architectural work. And I think facing with a kind of contemporary concern with genetics and developmental biology and computational work, I think this is a very, very critical question. And if 2 years ago Catherine tried to outline that field of study, she's back now to give us an animal update. Please welcome Catherine.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to come back. I think it feels to me like I kind of have a rhythm with the AA that I come back through every 2 or 3 years, and I'm in a different place with work that I'm doing, and I always am galvanized by what's going on here and always interested to see how things play here, and I'm thinking about the AA all the time, really, as is, I think, everybody in the architectural field. The title of the book is, the reason I bring this up is because it was something I thought about and changed about 1 million times, like what is going to be the order of these 3 words, animal, architecture, human. And I ended up with architecture first, and then animal, and then human. The reason being that the animal then kind of brokers the relationship between the architecture and the human in some way that is extremely rich and very complicated. But and in publishing also, it's actually very hard for my books to be categorized, so I always have to put architecture first so that they find their way into the right category initially. And but I would actually like architecture not always to be first, but it's a kind of pathology, I think. There's a lot of cords up here I'm getting snarled up in. Okay, animal update. Nothing will come from nothing is the name of my talk this evening. And you might ask, why an animal update? What's happened since I spoke last at the Architectural Association about the animal? That time, as Marianne said, I argued that Louis Sullivan's stock exchange trading room and its ability to be removed in fragments from the old stock exchange building, which was decrepit by that time, and reconstructed in the Art Institute of Chicago, was linked to the development of new assembly line processing of animals in the nearby Union stockyards. And both of these things, the stock exchange and the stockyards, were built around the same time and traded metaphors in a way. The idea was that not only is human life in the form of labor congealed in buildings, as a Marxist might claim, but that animal life is also, excuse me, I had this hibiscus tea, maybe it's like giving me a little frog in the throat, is not only human life is congealed in the building, but animal life is also congealed in buildings, specifically architectural buildings. That lecture prompted an audience member to come up to me afterwards and say, I liked your lecture a lot, or maybe she just said, I liked your lecture, but I thought it was really wild. Where do you come up with these things? Or something to that effect. The tone of that question, to be sure, applies to almost everything one might say about animals, whether it's in architecture or not. Yes, animal, what a word, Derrida exclaimed. It's a word we have given ourselves permission to use. The subject of life, animal or human, is wild. After many ideas, there is an exclamation mark of some kind, but after the idea of human life and animal life, there are about 1 million exclamation marks. Animal update, then, will be a kind of children's story, like Little Red Riding Hood or Robinson Crusoe, in which exclamation marks in a lot of different places and what the architect Irene Chang called animal envy will prevail. Indeed, it is only through some kind of revision or reversion to childhood that animals can be brought forward through the heavily armored shield of humanness, which, to be sure, has invested a great deal in forgetting its biological childhood. I understand also that audience member was asking something else, something about how historians or theorists in architecture find their subjects and then proceed to lecture on them, but I'm going to leave that too adult part of the matter for another time. What Derrida means, among other things, by exclaiming over the word animal is that there is strictly no such thing as the animal. He raises this flag at the same moment that he discredits Heidegger's appeal by way of differentiating animal from man to the work of the human hand. There are multiple animals, each a biological individual, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. And there are, at least in humans, 2 hands, coordinated but moving separately. Our technology is thus two-handed, which means in part that we may or may not be able to celebrate handedness as a unified evolutionary event that dignifies us as a species. When we say that the animal has no language, which is an equally profound differentiating claim, We collapse a vast multiplicity of differences, talents, behaviors, morphologies, and forms of consciousness into one amorphous concoction. For me, here, the interesting thing about this concoction, the animal, which is very serviceable for many purposes, philosophical and otherwise, although I'm going to completely avoid the ethical questions that are always raised with respect to animals now in contemporary philosophy. But what's interesting is that the animal, as an abstract category of being whose primary work is to oppose and stand outside of human life, emerges in history at more or less the same time as what we generally call cultural modernity. Cultural modernity was the massive number of movements hotly argued about where it began and what it developed, and intricate and constantly renewed in different ways, from within which and from which architectural modernity was precipitated. In fact, the animal is the name for an abolition, an exclusion that was fundamentally necessary to modernity in ways we have not examined before in architecture. Speaking generally, in broad sweeps, as befits a child's view of history, prior not only to Darwin but also to Brunelleschi, there was no theory of speciation, no theory of biological heredity, evolution, geology, time, mathematical space, or even history itself as we understand these concepts now. Although diverse conceptions and theories and hypotheses about all these things have been continuously under speculation in some form since humans began speculating. Aristotle speaks not of the animal, but of parts, movements, and progressions of animals. The world per se, planets, the cosmos. Mark, wake up. I need you to hear this. The world exists now and then in some kind of chaos that it is given meaning here and there, only on Earth, it seems, by art. Both animals and humans practice art, as Elizabeth Gross and Gilles Deleuze have argued, because art is an excess, an intensity, linked in nature to sexual expression, that, as Liz says, hijacks natural selection. Artistic expressions, such as birdsong, plumage, iridescence, or in our case, embellishment of food, paintings with charcoal in the Paleolithic caves of Lascaux, have no higher purpose, although they often evolve along with adaptive characteristics and contribute to an overall picture of reproductive success required for evolutionary survival. But fascinating as art is, I want to turn here for a moment not to the nature of art, but to the nature of chaos or nothingness within which these arts have found and continue to find their order. While we share as a species artistic expression and excess beyond needs with virtually every other animal, the idea of nothing, which has many meanings, but which I want to leave to use loosely, interchangeably with a kind of primal chaos, in which all animals, including ourselves, subsist, is the background to artistic expression, indeed to life itself. Chaos acts as the ground and background within which every object sits and against which it is thrown into relief. Is this not going forward for some reason? Do I have to do something? Oh, I need to get in there. Sorry, I'm not in the presentation. There we go. Okay, thanks. The ecstatic arts that an animal is able to marshal forth on its skin, in its song, in its more than adaptive structures, such as the leopard's spots, the frog's patterns, the snake's scales, the bird feathers, the cricket's song, usually for purposes of sexual attraction, the extent to which this excess reaches into a world of order, what we call the leopard's behavior, could be seen as the degree to which we understand the depth of the chaos from which it came, the background against which it stands, such that it becomes figure ground in some way. In other words, there is a connection, as Kaiwan knew in his description of mimicry, between chaos and nothingness and life's expansiveness as it is manifested in art and reproduction, sexual selection, natural selection. This is why nothingness, one of many names for chaos, the others are well known, the void, the nullity, the negation, the death, figures in every philosophical or theological account of the universe ever written. The nature of nothingness, however, one might say, has gone through its own historical development. Chaos may not differ in its essential character as that which opposes order, but it plays different roles and occupies different parts of the world at different points in time. Again, in our child's history, because so simple, yet charmingly convincing, prior to certain legendary Renaissance inventions, such as perspectival representation and later Cartesian mathematics, the definition and control of space is more haphazard, more dependent on memory and narratives. Space is not coordinated as we now understand that idea. This is a familiar but endlessly interesting story of how we have appeared to progress over time, and a reference of some kind to our dark age, the dark spacelessness from which we emerged as a species, culturally but also literally, into our current enlightened state. And to this story, by way of getting into a few details, I want to add a fictional character who is not a child, although childlike, but is an old medieval man whose name you already know, King Lear. The nothing will come from nothing. King Lear's famous words in Shakespeare's rendering of the medieval story about a perhaps real king named Lear, posed some special problems for nothingness. Before the Renaissance, Shakespeare's own time, and of course before modernity, we will seek to avoid slipping into irreality, as Judith Butler wrote about taking a fictional character as an example, although it may be unavoidable. Among other things, the words formulate nothingness, the phrase nothing will come of nothing, formulate nothingness as a generative but sterile equation. Nothing will come from nothing. In the Russian Giorgio Kozintsev's 1969 version of the play King Lear, the king's immense fortress sits in a harsh land inhabited by poor peasants who presumably work the land under a feudal system of property. This world is full of animals and remnants of animals. At the beginning of the play, King Lear, played by Yuri Jarvit, takes up a map of his kingdom in order to divide the land between his daughters in exchange for how well they state their love for him, the king. The map in Kozintsev's Lear, as in most productions, is an animal skin covered with some version of map marks, typically not a contemporary map. In Peter Brook's version, the actor Paul Schofield's, who portrayed a very dark version of King Lear, a particular darker than dark version of King Lear, portrays this map far more accurately, I think, as 3 animal skins, one for each daughter, that wrap what appear to be clods of earth, so that each time he presents a piece of land to the daughter, he essentially gives the daughter a clump of earth wrapped in an animal skin. Lear and most of the men in his court are dressed in animal skins as well. Again, in the Peter Brook version, Lear's animal skin is an extremely thick and large coat that give him a sort of animal hump on his back, or an animal collar. Outside the fortress where Lear finds himself all too soon, there are wolves and other blurred beasts rustling, howling, and threatening in the bushes, and the entourage he takes with him for part of his exile before he loses everything is largely animal, such as beasts of burden, of course. Some are taken as food from birds and goats and sheep, and some domestic animals, and some as pets, dogs, horses, many dogs, in fact. The place in which Lear lands after his various failed encounters with trying to find a new home in his daughter's house. This is Goneril's house in the Kozintsev's version. And then from there, Lear goes to a swept plain that is attempting a kind of, insofar as it's possible to do in film, a kind of spacelessness, and a place that by necessity all the metaphors of spacelessness and chaos have to be piled up in the form of cold and heat and rain and insanity and wind and so forth, not just because these are specified by Shakespeare, but because all the props available to the filmmaker are typically needed to indicate that Lear's madness is something more than a personal crisis of old age or a narcissistic fit. Kozintsev seems to attempt to imagine, following Shakespeare's descriptions, but also following accounts of medieval world from which the myth of King Lear comes, he seems to try to imagine what human life would be in a world without coordinates, without generative capabilities or containment, where memory is impaired, so there is literally no way back to the fortress, and Lear's memory is fading, and he so in a way written into a certain senility is a kind of description of the cosmos. And the fortress itself, in any case, is just a hunk of stone, cold, massive, and heavy. This is perhaps how the filmmaker have contended with the nothingness implied in those initial words of the king, "Nothing will come of nothing." To recast very briefly the first scene of that play, Lear is dividing his kingdom into 3 pieces, one for each daughter. In return, as I said, the daughters are to tell him how much they love him. The first 2 daughters comply with this outrageous suggestion. Then he turns to his favorite daughter, Cordelia, and says, "Now our joy, last but not least, Cordelia, what can you say to draw a third that is richer than your sisters? Speak." To which Cordelia responds famously, "Nothing, father." "Nothing?" asked the king. Cordelia, "Nothing." King, "Who speaks? Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again." Lear will be very sorry later that he put the word nothing into this particular formulation, and also that he has asked Cordelia to speak again, because her response essentially tips him into a sanity that is lying in wait for him. Rosalind Krauss, speaking of the invention of perspectival representation by her critique of the retinal all-at-once vision claimed by Clement Greenberg for modernist painting, pointedly reverses Lear's words. "Far from nothing coming from nothing," she writes in The Optical Unconscious, "the truth that arises from this Euclidean meeting of parallel lines is that point beyond the limit of imagining during the construction of a perspective. This is the solidity of the construction's basis in geometric law. The vanishing point, which she calls an infinite rapidity, is the nothing that solidifies, in Krauss's formulation, the geometric construction of modern space." In our story, this evolution of nothing into something, that is, a vanishing point, also recalls an ancient and profound evolutionary event that paleontologists are very fond of citing, and which does seem extremely dramatic: the event of standing up. It harks back to those animals who stood up on a savanna, thus freeing the face from the ground and the hand from locomotive function, setting the brain into this idealized developmental path toward humanness. It is at that moment that the horizon line appears and begins to develop as an optical goal of some kind. I have argued in other places, as have many others, in a kind of perpetual homage and also critique of Erwin Panofsky, that Brunelleschi's invention of perspective in the Renaissance begins to redefine and fill in a terrifying and powerful nothingness with something we now call space that was specific, measurable, inhabitable, neutral, even friendly. Lear's utterance to Cordelia, quite vicious, I think, that she speak again because nothing will come of nothing, is therefore not simply a remark made by an angry father to a recalcitrant daughter. It is a statement about the world, not even yet a world in any modern sense, not a coordinated place, but a temporary occupation defined by some human ability to be temporarily enclosed by walls. This utterance is also Lear literally enunciating a medieval theory of reproduction by which life is understood to be generational, fathers and daughters, but the precise manner in which inherited traits are passed along is obtuse. Something is owed by Lear and Cordelia to this inheritance, which is why Cordelia's response is consequential, but is an inarticulate debt. It is not coincidental that Lear literally must cut into his own kinship with his family to attempt to ferret out this sterile nullity, this curse on reproductive life, on biological being. Nothing will come from nothing. Both the cosmic and the local effect of nothing will come from nothing in Lear result in a battle between art and chaos, where Lear's artfulness fails to withstand chaos. And perhaps Shakespeare's art itself, in writing the play, is also threatened. The play has been said to be unactable, too strung out between too many things, too verbose, too histrionic, bordering on the pathological. The famous tradition of Shakespearean actors who attempt to master Shakespeare's heightened and dense language by using rhythms and cadences to stay in touch with the meaning of the words, a kind of sing-song, is severely tested by this play. In Lear's world, in other words, nothing will come from nothing is an extremely dangerous remark because it implies its corollary, which is anything may come from anything. Reproduction of things and being is simultaneously subject to the horror of the void and the generational, though sterile, logic of the monster. There is, in fact, as Francois Jacob, the geneticist, recounts in his book called The Logic of Life, no theory of heredity, no accurate biological theory of descent until the 18th century. The 18th century, as you know, is only a couple of hundred years ago compared with the millions of years life has been on Earth. Before the Renaissance, you could easily get lost in space, which is a nonsensical statement because nobody would have thought so, perhaps. But in effect, the absence of a theory of space means that space is filled with black holes and discontinuities. So your daily passage through space cannot be uneventful. Animate beings, at the same time, would, without being bound by a theory of heredity to any particular form of genesis, would be capable of breeding with inanimate objects, the weather capable of malevolence, hybridity rampant, divine mortal. These are, in a way, the cliches of our understanding of a spaceless pre-modern world, a kind of tumult of identifications where the human hunter does not triumph. Forms, animate or inanimate, come about somehow from organic and inorganic energies and forces that are slapped together in the midst of chaos and are held together by a weak glue that can be dissolved by any number of substances. So art exists, but in the case of human art, it is tentative, not grounded, floating, again, in a kind of child's account. As these birds in this medieval sketchbook are floating, in a sense, delightful and diverse, but with no relation to each other. Were the animals in King Lear, if they had been, in a sense, less resisted and more represented, that whole black and white, spaceless world would have been filled with color and song, although genealogically and spatially ungrounded. You could say, following Elizabeth Gross again, that Lear's world is a world where human artistic excess has been cut off by genealogical chaos, and that is the larger tragic dimension of his story. In light of this, moving to a more contemporary period of history, were we to again compare Colin Rowe, echoing Colin Rowe, Palladio's Villa Capua Rotunda with Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, we might notice a couple of things that we didn't notice before, or maybe they're the same things we noticed before, but they have a different meaning. We might notice, for example, that Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, for example, has both interior and exterior generative modes, whereas the Villa Capua Rotunda, Renaissance to be sure, so it's not quite as ignorant of possible spatial formats as, say, Gothic cathedrals, has a dominantly exterior mode. It is possible to cut a section through the Villa Capua Rotunda, but the inside can be said to have only resulted from the outside. Rowe is correct in saying, I think, that we embrace both buildings from without, as owners looking in from the verdant landscape, and a bird's eye view typically, or a worm's eye view, that can almost, but not quite, grasp all four sides of the building at once. And for our purposes here, it is worth noticing that this works especially well with the Capua Rotunda, because that space is best unpacked through its external loggias, whereas famously, the inner eye of the Villa Savoy is already wide open and looking out. In other words, space, which brings with it everything about space, inside and outside, border zones, liminal zones, and so forth, is elusive in Palladio and crystalline in Le Corbusier. A heavy exteriority defends in Palladio against a still very real pressure from the outside, pressure of chaos, perhaps the pressure of animal life. Here is one of my animal points. In the enlivened darkness of the child's tale, the danger from animals to the human enclave in a pre-modern environment is very great. Our human enclave has been guaranteed by structures for most of our history as a species, but in pre-modern setting, our houses and towns are vulnerable because animals possess the world in some sense, and we could easily stumble into their domain once we leave the house. The churches and institutional buildings of antiquity, right up to the 18th century, in gradually decreasing ways, use motifs lavishly, drawn from the world around them, and most of these motifs are literally and spiritually derived from the animal world. Gargoyles, bulls, cows, horses, dogs, goats, insects, reptiles, bees, and so forth, and so on. And in most cases, the use of these motifs simultaneously register the force of this exterior world and attempt to symbolically disallow the animal from entering the structure. That conceit I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the animal, emerges in what you might call our existential adulthood as a species, although it seems slightly weird to talk that way. And it can only emerge in modernity from the background of some fantastical childhood, such as I have barely etched the outlines of, and which, as we enter architectural modernity with a vengeance in the 20th century, is kept alive and alluded to only by the surrealists, by Breton, and then by what Breton and then Lacan calls the little reality of the psyche, which is where, in a certain sense, that fantastical childhood nests while modernity goes forward. The master's bedroom of Max Ernst, for example, includes things, table, a bed, a tree, a bear, a snake, a whale, that are drawn, excised from a table of taxonomies, a child's school chart for learning objects in the world. These things are superimposed, keeping their original spatial location, which is flat, onto the perspectival grid of a room, and yet fail to recede according to the perspectival rules of the room. Architectural modernity, for the most part, as we already know in a million ways, became interested for a variety of reasons in a full and magnificent eradication and abolition, a campaign of abolition of nature and objects of nature, directing space in such a way as to coordinate interior and exterior modes, rationalizing the city, of course, straightening out the lines of descent, directing materials toward the truths and gravities represented by primal materials such as granite, marble, steel, and glass, hard materials either taken or manufactured from the earth, and using artistic forms and practices of a mature adulthood, an adulthood filled with gravity. A mature adulthood might mean many things, of course, pejorative and otherwise, but perhaps here it might mean that modernism felt a real stability around the concepts of the past, present, and future, and pursued a kind of homeostatic set of relationships in their architectures, a balanced, a mythological balance in some way. Decoration, of course, these are, in a sense, familiar topics. Decoration becomes sublimated into structure and materials, and the perfect expression, perhaps, of modernism's a theory of trees is Mises' screen in the Tugendhat house made from the peeled ebony tree, one peeled ebony tree. Or the theory of animal life might be expressed perfectly in the animal skin rug or the cow skin upholstery on Le Corbusier's reclining chair. Pilotes, as Rem later shows us, might also be a kind of animal leg or an animal set of supports, and the animal is now routinely broken into parts and skinned and partitioned. A kind of disciplining of architecture and a breakup of the animal world. The animal encloses philosophically millions of diverse species in order to control them and keep them corralled away, figuratively and eventually literally, from human life. And this, inside of which our political and cultural histories of cultural change and transition take place, is what Giorgio Agamben calls the pivotal event of modernity. The Enlightenment project was to make of everything something, even nothingness. Heidegger, the early Heidegger, argued in What is Metaphysics that because our scientific existence gives matter the first and last word, being, that is Dasein, finds a new relation to itself. Science, he writes, wishes to know nothing of the nothing, and yet must call on the nothing for help. I have been, of course, equating nothingness with a certain set of conditions, spatial voids, and so forth, obtuse conceptions of biological life and generation. All of my so far enunciated theories of nothingness rely on nothingness as a kind of negation or a nullity. The ex nihilo nihil fit, which is from nothing comes to be of antiquity, is non-being, unformed matter. Lear's loss of architecture and matter, and of himself, being, and of his daughters, generational power, is also a world in which monstrosity thrived, as I said, because form was capable of being unformed by strange and unpredictable forces. In modernity, Heidegger writes, Dasein means essentially being held out into the nothing. Without, he writes this, without the original revelation of nothing, there is no selfhood and no freedom. It is the ground against which this, and thus becomes a kind of positive ground, against which the self is formed, from which the self is freed. And this was until very recently the new nothingness. that had itself, in a sense, corralled the problems of the nothing. So as we begin to release some of our modern inheritance in genetics, say, or philosophy or computational architectures, certain things begin to make a reappearance. Our mixed lines of genetic descent, for example, are now yielding themselves up for examination. And the morphological intertwining of our form with other morphologies in the world, as most of the theories of evolutionary developmental biologists now define animal form as connected with every other animal form, so that what they mean is that every single form in the world is arises from the pressure exerted by other forms in the world, so that animals that are even removed ecologically great distances from each other are seen to be part of a large system of pressure against form. I want to use just the remaining time to give a little more shape to what so far has been a pretty fast and kind of airy flight through the history of nothingness and the problems of space, and hone in on a few more specific developments and give a little bit of a small piece of the genetic picture to see whether, in fact, there is a kind of now a release that I'm talking about, and also a small piece of the philosophical picture, both of which might qualify the architectural picture. According to the law of conservation, energy, and matter, as you well know, new forms of energy or matter are rarely, if ever, encountered. Nothing can be created out of nothing, Gregory Bateson writes, riffing on King Lear. In Bateson's discussion of these laws of conservation, which he says are more like expectations rather than laws, he is most interested in the problem of information. Nothing will come of nothing, he writes in 1979, without new information, he adds. Greg Lynn, as you probably remember, was interested in William Bateson, Gregory Bateson's father, his work, precisely for its implications in architecture around this question of the addition of information. Arguing, his particular argument is not quite in the sort of mode that this is building toward, but I'll say it anyway because it's quite interesting. He was trying to argue against the classical presupposition that symmetry in architecture was natural in a kind of harmonics with nature, or familiar with the proportion arguments about symmetry. Greg argued that, on the contrary, symmetry in the development of living organisms is not a default or natural development. It requires additional genetic information that happens developmentally along the way through the evolution of the development of the organism. Information, as Gregory Bateson, again the son of William Bateson, is using it, is fugitive. It's easily destroyed by randomness and is subject to any entropic forces lying around. The messages and guidelines for order exist only, as it were, he said, in sand or as written on the surface of waters. Almost any disturbance will destroy them. To be meaningful, Bateson writes, to recognize messages as patterns, every regularity must meet with complementary regularities, perhaps skills, and these skills are as evanescent as the patterns themselves. The genesis of skills to respond to messages is what Bateson calls the other side of evolution. It is, therefore, a kind of co-evolution. One part of organic evolution is the realm, as you may already know, of epigenesis, or what is now called morphogenesis, a consideration of how form of an animal arrives during development from an environment acting on living material. And I'm going to do a very, very short kind of discussion of this because it sets up the next part. Every embryo, and you may be familiar with this discussion already in some form because a lot of people have been arguing and working through this material. Every embryological step is an act of becoming, as Waddington, who coined the term epigenesis, argued. Every step must be built upon. For Waddington, new information is added at every stage of development. Development itself, as Bateson remarks, is a complex tautology in which the organism, in a sense, unfolds, like Euclid's geometry, from its base. But it undergoes various types of change, permanent types of change in the process of development that feed back to that base. In contrast with epigenesis, there's a whole realm of creativity, art, learning, and cultural evolution. The essence of epigenesis is predictable repetition, Bateson writes, like from like. The essence of learning and evolution is exploration and change. There is, as we know, a very long and ongoing argument between nature and culture, not only from the culture side, but from the nature side. In the transmission of human and animal culture, that which has been learned rather than given, the parents attempt routinely to pass on skills and values to the next generation. This typically succeeds at the moment, so to speak, insofar as every organism needs skills to live, to practice art, and to optimize opportunities for furtherance. But the passage of skills and values to a new generation almost always fails in any direct sense. Learning, Bateson says, leads to an overpacked mind. By returning to the unlearned, the ongoing species again and again clears its memory banks to be ready for the new. It is out of these random possibilities that organisms collect, in a sense, or respond to new mutations, which in turn allow them to succeed reproductively. And it is also out of the same random possibilities that certain kinds of learning based on patterns that can be analyzed statistically, the search for order and pattern gathers its solutions. So coevolution is a mutual gathering out of randomness, chaos, and nothingness of order and developmental opportunities subject to natural selection. A geneticist working somewhat later than Bateson, Gerald Edelman, which was also very influential on some of the early computational architects, also, and who was interested in biology and genetics in the 1990s. There was actually, the architects who were working in the 1990s were citing Edelman, and the scientists from whom was adopted in architecture the term animate form, which was the title of Edelman's book, Topobiology, written in 1988. Edelman, with others, Lewontin famously, was trying to trace organic development more precisely through its various stages in order to argue that cellular development depends on place, and that's where the topos comes in, and like Bateson, the exchange of signals, information, so that cells in process of development are up to a certain point and for a period of time in contact with each other. They're kind of discussing their careers, I would say. The one cell says, no, I want to go to the arm, and the other cell says, no, you go to the leg, I'll go to the skin or something. So there's this sort of interchange between the cells about what they want to be in their adult life. They're discussing, they're in communication across the borders of what he calls cell collections, and they induce each step in genetic development as a function of the history that yields form. And this is a controversial kind of theory, although Edelman was one of the, sort of is an incredibly powerful geneticist, and so there's a lot of play in this theory. The opposing theory is that everything develops in an executive way from the gene, and that there's no communication. There's new information, but it's already written, it's already given in advance by the DNA. The question here is in the interest of allowing the question, at least one of them here, in the interest of addressing how form arises during development, is how does an organism at a cellular level capture genetic advantage in order to transmit it? And for Edelman, more fundamentally, how do genes determine traits? And this is important for various reasons that are not obviously exclusively in the domain of genetics, because the way in which the organism develops and pushes against its skin, and on the other hand, how the species succeeds genetically in the world in its ecological niche, and how it gets that information back into the genetic structure so that you have a real transmittal of information such that a mutation can be taken advantage of by the species and the species can expand. So that it's really a tricky relationship between culture and nature, where what you learn as an organism in a niche is transmitted back into the genetic structure, which is not usually the case with cultural skills, as Gregory Bateman said. So it's so that this theory of topobiology is really trying to work that divide between the inner and the outer, the inside and the outside of the organism. I'm not going to go into these debates in much greater detail here, except to say that the outcome of this debate will be consequential for certain kinds of architectural work, at least in theoretical terms. Computational work in architecture has taken it for granted, in a way, that processes initiated in iterative, neo-evolutionary systems modeled by the computer will necessarily break through the membrane of the skin into so-called programmatic space of the lives lived in architectural space, and vice versa. But perhaps this is now even a moot point. Computers are not really biological, and the models they build may have nothing to do with biological processes. Darwin observed, without being able to say exactly how he saw this, since he saw in effect simultaneously what was there and what was not there, that the vast diversity of related species must have arisen from differences in animal environment, outside pressures and adaptations, and from different roads taken inside the organism, internal pressures and adaptations, known as natural selection. Edelman's work, which increasingly seeks to find a biological explanation for consciousness itself, the mind-brain problem, began with a study of the emergence of specific mechanisms in biological organisms that are not fully differentiated in early stages of development, but differentiate later. He uses the example of feather development in order to try and show that genetic information undergoes different changes in its destination. Feathers are an excellent example, he says, of forms that result from biologically constrained genes. These morphoregulatory mechanisms are like Bateson's skills, and they account for the vast diversity of feather systems in birds. In Edelman's work, it is as if these are now no longer floating birds. These are birds that have been pinned down and identified. In Edelman's work, it is as if molecular biological systems are being brought closer and closer to the permeable membrane between an interior and exterior milieu. And in the process, a new kind of biology is being formed. He attempts to change the scale and relationship between outside and inside. Edelman's recommendation is that we do not try to model the human mind, that is, the contained, but instead try to model the brain, the armature, the container, and then set up a system of stimuli that will in effect create a mind. This has been, as you might imagine, also of great interest to a series of architects who have been trying to model neurological containers that will sufficiently connect through their smartness with the neurologically contained, mainly ourselves. There are also some interesting problems with this, not least of which is the same problem of how nothing will come of nothing. The way that that phrase plunges us into a world with a knowledge of heredity or an inkling of a knowledge of heredity, but no reproductive coherence. Every rule of a rule-based architecture both advances and restrains the iterative potentials of that architecture. Edelman does not agree, for example, with Norbert Wiener, who in 1952 believed the computer should co-model the brain and nervous system of the human being. Edelman believes instead that any model of the brain, of the container that is, must follow a fully biological logic that can be outlined on the computer but cannot be of the computer. And he presumably means, I don't know exactly what he means, but I think he means it can't just be like the human genome that's mapped in gene sequences. It has to be living, information-full model, living tissue of some kind. Some of the images that I've been showing you are, in fact, trying to do that in an artistic sense, and what looked like the wireframe of the wings is from the culture tissue, I think it's called the Culture, Tissue and Art Project in Australia, where they are trying to grow living tissue as a sort of way of modeling certain systems. It's totally theoretical artistic practice. It's not a genetic laboratory. But the problem of wings was something they've been exploring for a long period of time because of wings have this tremendous sort of metaphoric power. Architecture, to some degree, has been relying on computational modeling as a suggestive way of understanding what various modes of interactive containment might be. In particular, organic development and organisms themselves, such as frogs, skin patterns, schools of fish, scales, feathers, and so forth, have been acting as fertile ground for architectural design in this development of a kind of brain. But architecture, I think, has essentially lost interest, if it even ever had it, in the question of biological life. And I think that this means that it has lost interest in a way in the problem of communication and information that these geneticists are talking about in that particular argument. And I think it's lost interest in a sense in, and initially up front has lost interest in a sense in the live subject for which we write our architectural programs, and also in a sense from the whole organic discussion or discussion of the organism in space and milieu. And we could say, I suppose at this point, well, who cares, and why not continue with these amazing and exuberant explorations into these new realms of technology, fabrication, production of material, and that is what we really do the best, and that would be right, in a sense. I'm for that. And I like all this, sort of exploratory, investigative, and very creative and fabulously formally inventive work. But I feel, having made this sort of, given this kind of theoretical base to the problem of biological life, that I recognize something, or I feel as if I recognize something of a danger in this process, which doesn't really belong to the computer per se, but the intersection of the biological and the computational something. And this is, in effect, I think, Edelman's point. Perhaps the issue or risk, I don't know, might be what one would call the possibility of sterility, the failure of reproductive powers or powers of generation that keeps and makes form, skin, feathers, hard surfaces, not as we would need in a sustainable architecture, for example, a zone of nutrient resource, reproductive, informational exchanges between environments. This would be what the zoologist Uch Kuhl, who was very influential on Deleuze for a variety of reasons about what parallel worlds in which animals live, has called an island of senses in organisms, how organisms inhabit islands of senses, and they send out probes into other environments in order to gather information or nutrients from that environment, but they essentially don't know that environment or don't know of that other animal, just as we don't really know of other animals than ourselves. This is certainly that domain, that promised domain of intersection between what's coming from one side and what's coming from the other is amazingly weird and productive. And it works in organisms because it's, this coevolutionary, this drawing of order from all sides. And so this kind of brings us back, in a sense, to the animals that I began with. As a sort of, by way of a conclusion, I want to give just a very brief summary, I guess summary is the right word, of what would be called a philosophical position on all this, contemporary philosophical position, again, leaving the ethical question to the side. If you agree with Giorgio Agamben, who is a philosopher that many people are reading now for a whole variety of reasons, he would suggest that we are now coming, partly because of genetic research, but also partly because of other political events, we are coming in our history as a species back into a kind of animal state. Agamben argues that the exclusion or the exception that biological life has typically been in modernity, that it's been that which has been left out of political consideration, has resulted paradoxically in what he calls biological modernity. Unlike Aristotle, he says, who thought of man as a living animal with the additional capacity for political existence, man, Agamben argues, is an animal whose politics call his existence as a living being into question. Biological modernity, he continues, is situated at the point at which the species and the individual, as a simple living body, become what is at stake in a society's political strategies. Our contemporary biopolitics, out of which have come the Holocaust in Agamben. Agamben's particularly interested in the Holocaust, which was, of course, entailed the death of many bodies. And our current sense of universal entitlement to security and health care is a further elaboration of this biological modernity that Agamben claims for our historical moment. The entry of Zoe, or bare life, he writes, into the sphere of politics, constitutes the decisive event of modernity and signals a radical transformation of political philosophical categories of classical thought. Biological modernity operates according to the logic of what Agamben calls the state of exception, what has been excluded, bare life, the domestic, private, reproductive life, is what now becomes at stake. Agamben is speaking, and this is to some degree after Foucault's biopolitics and biopolitical theory. Agamben is speaking of human biological life, but human, for him, does not exclude animalness. In his book, The Open, he suggests that we as humans have a theriomorphic, that is an animal-headed destiny, in which we will discover again our animalness, and that he takes on Heidegger, working against Heidegger's idea of what Heidegger calls the open, which Heidegger claims is only available to human life. The lark does not see the open, Heidegger says. Agamben, disagreeing with Heidegger, argues that humans in reality become more animalized as they move into the openness or unconcealedness of their own being. In order to do this, as I mentioned earlier, they must hang out in the nothing, and they must be hung out in the nothing. And in doing so, they begin to see the open the way a beast would see it. The poet Rainer Marie Rilke, in his chilling and incisive Eighth Duino Elegy, also says that it is the creature world that beholds the open with all its eyes, but our human eyes, as though reversed, encircle it on every side like traps. Children's heads, Rilke says, have to be turned around and forced to look backwards so as not to see what is outside, which we can only know from the brute's face. The open, were we to give it a kind of leaden spatial character, might be simultaneously something like the deep interior spaces of our architectures, where humans both enrobe and disrobe themselves of humanness, culture, fashion, clothing, language, and the outside space that we look into with all our gazes from within the Villa Savoy. I think I'm off my, yeah, these are part of the tissue culture. The frame, they're trying to look for an armature, a polymer armature for a frame for growing flesh on, which they succeed in doing. But of course you can't attach it to anything. The artist Francis Bacon commented that cages bind animals to the viewer. It is only domestic architectures that even remotely resemble cages in their ability to bind us to a view of ourselves, bringing ourselves into focus in a self-referential world of signification and mediated desires. The architectural part, should it be present, is meant as an enhancement of this system of reference, the humanist architectures. Bacon's well-known painting entitled Man and Dog, where both man and dog are outside any house or cage, portrays both man and dog as inchoate, faceless figures, effaced, disinterested, bored, worn down by each other. Because it is a Bacon painting, there is also the chance that we can read a certain anguish in the pathetic and empathetic attachment between man and dog, linked as they are by a leash that in the painting seems to be tied to each equally. Bacon also painted a dog turning on a carpet, looking for a place to rest. He based this painting on the 19th century study of motion by Maré, motion capture by Maré, so that each stage of the dog's movement is not registered as a separate frame, as Muybridge did with his experiments, but as with Maré, we see a blurred form and again a kind of anguish of indecision, some idea about settlement that doesn't settle easily. Animal settlement is like this turning and turning inside some geometric circle to make a place to settle. It is blurry, not sharp, like the Photoshop reproductions of our fashionable selves in our architectural compositions, not really described, the space of this turning, by saying in the living room or in the bedroom. We might ask in what sense architecture really matters to life itself. Why bother with these issues at all? And with Elizabeth Gross, in a sense, I agree that we are implicated insofar as we were doing art in architecture, participating in a kind of supplemental or excessive act, a sort of intensification of building, that we, like other animals, practice a form of excess that is not related to some natural organic process of selection. So insofar as we're part of a world, organic world, of evolutionary world, our art brings us into that at the level of the animal. In another way, architecture is so profoundly involved with life, even if life is a sort of metaphor and a pretext for the practice of architecture, as it often is, in both philosophical and biological ways, you could almost say that architecture is the specific evidence of animal life in human life. And that is, at least in part, my current picture of what animals, as opposed to the animal, the nature and culture of generative skins that come about through communication information, and art that confronts nothingness with different strategies of excess, have to do with architecture at this moment, and it's the end of my animal update.
Thank you very much. Would you take any questions now?
Sure. No, that's questions are okay. Yeah.
Just I would like to say that Catherine is giving a seminar tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the front members' room. And of course, course, we'll have the chance to discuss further. But if there are any immediate questions.
Although the seminar's on a separate subject, but related in some way, yeah. People are thinking. People need to think.
Yes.
Or not.
Well, you're distinguishing architecture, human animal. You seem to step aside from what we might call a more primary distinction between being dead and alive. And I guess that in architectural terms, historically anyway, for most people who have heard something of architectural history, the question of dead and alive might also register as organic or inorganic. After all, organic has a sort of notorious history in architectural parlance. It all seems ironic to me that the term organic enters cultural discourse at precisely the point when in chemistry it seems to lose its power at the point when chemists began to synthesize chemicals that were previously thought to be only producible by living entities. So I wondered if you need to you're reserving the animal away from the question of the organic and the dead and the alive.
The question of the animate and the inanimate is always a question. I mean, it's always under discussion. But I don't. But are you saying that you? Well, what would? How should I talk about the dead and the alive? I mean, I think I understand.
The organic, or one example of the alive. There is the vegetative
Right. Yeah. No, I think I agree with you that it's not discussed as carefully as very specific developments in history, as you say, that where certain things are included and then other things are excluded and so forth. And it goes through a whole period of identification where we think that certain inanimate things turn out to be animate, and like lichen or moss and other things like that. So it's true that I don't go through the specific history of development around that question of the inanimate and the animate. And it's painted fairly crudely as both Jacob and Foucault, account of the transition from a period of not understanding how things are connected or why one thing is animate and the other thing is not, is a period where things arrive at their identifications through similitude. I mean, they look appearances, that they share a certain look and therefore get connected to each other through appearance or resemblance, and that even connects across to whatever kind of scientific use of plants or animals. Plants that look like eyes are therefore understood to be good for curing eye disease and other things like that in a sort of early medical understanding. So all those relationships between the dead and the alive, or the inanimate and the animate, go through a whole series of changes and relationships in which at one time, what's left out is included and so forth. But the animal is always alive, and it is never in the realm of the inanimate. It is the definition of the animate from the beginning. So maybe there are cases where the animal or animals are. I don't think animals are ever mistaken for the inanimate. I mean, they are that which makes the distinction between the animate and the inanimate possible in a way. But that's just speaking very generally. I'm sure there are really interesting instances that that could be spoken to where there's, I mean, especially with respect to monstrosity or monsters, where in a sense an animal has reached a kind of geological or biological dead end and can no longer reproduce, and is in mythical form, as in the form of a kind of hybrid of all sorts of different parts, and has reached a sort of dead end as a biological animal. But I don't know that I think it's a really interesting point, and I would like to think more about that. But are you thinking of, would you say, do you know instances where, well, maybe that's not what I want to know. It would be interesting to, well, maybe I ask you, why is it important to take up that, yeah.
I'm being almost naively architectural historical, and just recalling the philology of the term organic as it's born upon architecture since the 19th century. And the repeatedly claused term organic, often it's the term of approbation as opposed to the inorganic, alive as opposed to the dead. And yet the fact is that architecture is mineral for the most part, ultimately. And so all attempts to infuse this dead mineral, crystalline,
Yeah, with life, yeah.
with life, seem to come back, turn around that. But I mean, in Coleridge, Emerson, Thoreau, Sullivan, Wright, the term organic is repeatedly valorized.
Right.
But at the same time, the term organic is being, in 19th century chemistry, repeatedly questioned and since dissolved.
Right. Well, the organic, as it's been, in that period of architectural history and in literature, and the organic is being used as kind of idealization of the hopefulness for a certain lifelikeness, and it's those are amazingly interesting texts. So I don't want to really kind of summarize it in one remark, but that the vegetative is particularly valuable because it's static. And it doesn't move in the way that the animal moves. So you can use vegetative motifs, as Sullivan and Wright do, as a way of sort of bringing in, by way of, again, it's almost medieval in a way, a kind of decorative or supplementary motif from the world around that. Just perhaps it works the way the animal works in the motif of the medieval building, that it works to fend off the real animal, which is all too present, and possibly the vegetative motif is meant to do the same thing. It's not meant to invite in the organic, but it's meant to keep it out of architecture. And how the vegetative in the contemporary 19th century and 19th, 20th century uses of the organic, why that would be true. I mean, I have to think about why that would be true, why that would be problematic to have, or why you would use the vegetative as a form of fending off a certain real incursion of nature or landscape. But in medieval, use of the gargoyle or any other, a number of thousands of examples of the animal on the outside of the building as a sort of symbolic homage in one way, and a gathering of things from the world onto the building, which buildings always do, but also a repudiation of a very real kind of threat, I would say, or very real pressure from the outside. I was just actually looking at the British Museum at those Assyrian lion hunts, and I was reading the text there, and it was very strange. And they were saying, you know, that lions at this particular period of time, because there had been a lot of rain, were rampant. They were putting incredible pressure on the human population. There was like war. I mean, there was like war of these lions, and so you imagine our dominance is so complete that it seems comical that such would be the case. You know, we wouldn't know quite how to figure a world in which the building could not be, when our enclaves could not protect us, in a sense. So I'm not really enumerating literal conditions necessarily of animal threat, but I think it's different to understand animal motifs as a sort of homage to agricultural life, or to view them as fetishes or as uses of symbolic decoration in order to encrust the building with a protective coat against animal life that eventually becomes a way of organizing human life. So that architecture plays a very direct role in that, the organization of the human, conditions of humanity, conditions of being human, and which later, evolve. So that, but yeah.
Could I ask about, how what you just said relates to the question of whether a building is kind of dead or alive? Because it seems to me that what you just said comes near to relating the life of a building to something which is quite close to sort of what used to be called totemism. But it falls under the heading of some kind of animals paraphernalia. As the organic. And because you were using the example of kind of medieval, if one thinks of a figure like Notre Dame de Paris in the Victor Hugo novel, the question is, what makes the building of Notre Dame alive or dead? Now, it seems to me that the novel proposes rather different kinds of criteria. The one would be that, in some sense, famously, Victor Hugo says, when the priest, looks at the printing press and says, "This will kill that," as if the technology of knowledge will mortify building. But you could also take another theme, which is in some sense the breathing, the capacity of Quasimodo to be a kind of breathing animal inside the cathedral is also a kind of relation of animation to the building. So I'm kind of wondering, what it seems to me, what's insistent is that the idea that there should be animation of the building, but it's not clear that that's an animal.
Yeah, Alberti, calls the building an animal. He says you have to look at the building as an animal because you have to look at it as a harmonizing of certain parts, so that it's really only in a funny way as an animal is understood to be capable of being partitioned, which is understood in different times in different ways, that it becomes a kind of part, potentially a part of understanding symmetry, or now systems of digestion or any number of other kind of ways in which the animal has been brought forth as something that you can take a piece of and use as a way in enlivening a particular relationship in an inanimate object. So insofar, I don't think there's, I mean, I don't think the building is an animal. I don't think, I don't think it ever is an animal. I mean, it's actually, but that's what makes it interesting to me as a way, is that it's totally dead in almost every way, except for the fact that it is, that you could say it yearns to be alive, and it also belongs to conditions of life, unlike sculpture, unlike any kind of other art. So that's the, in a way, the conundrum, because it rubs up against life routinely and in every way, and so there have been various postures of it toward life throughout history, and the animal has been present in a whole variety of ways at these moments of posturing toward life. But I don't think it is a biological entity, the building. I think the desire to animate it is a tremendously deep desire, and I think everybody's been incredibly ingenious about trying to find ways to animate it, and the computer has allowed us all sorts of operations, but what it hasn't allowed us is animation, in a way, right? I mean, the animation is really hardly won. You have to really work to win it, in a way, from the computer, because the computer is, front-loaded. You have to give it a whole set of instructions in order for it to realize certain conditions, and so it's just plodding along, kind of realizing those conditions, and it's why you can't use really more than one system at a time, in a way, to marshal these living systems together. It's usually you're operating in, one mode, which has its own features, rather than being able to quickly jump in with another mode, just the way the one system supplements and differentiates and compensates for the other in a living body. Everything is coordinated, as Bernard said. It's a whole system of organization that's coordinated, and you can't do that in a way yet, and maybe never with animation software. So I think that, I don't know, I don't think the building is alive. I don't think it's about saying the building is animal. I think it's trying to understand a kind of cluster of relationships that have a very profound kind of historical set of, things happening with it. There's long-term association of architecture with the organic, with life, with the animal, with, striving for a certain kind of mobility and animation. Other times trying for a kind of static positioning, belonging to certain, trees of architectural trees, as Bannister Fletcher, and all sorts of ins and outs throughout that history of a sort of connectivity with the problem of life. And I just think it's uniquely true of architecture that, there's a very specific kind of bending toward that problematic. And that's why, and I also have to say that I feel that there is right now a real, simultaneously, no interest in the program and at all, and so that in a way it's the mobilizing of the mineral, you could say, that really we're interested in right now, and that the program is really still operating in its kind of modernist functional way, and that this crossover between the membrane, through the membrane, or as the skin crosses over and releases into the landscape, surface, roof, whatever it is, as it begins to erase those kind of joints, that there's this hope also that it will have this become increasingly thick, increasingly able to pass things through it, that will arrive at this possibly completely idealized notion that the building will be supplying a new kind of information, and that the development of the life inside that kind of programmatic will no longer be the modernist program. It will be something else. And that we're not yet tackling that part of it, partly because it doesn't, we're not animating in a certain way. we're not really too interested in animation in a way. Yeah.
May I ask something? I don't know. Are we to understand organic and biological as kind of identifiable or
As unidentifiable?
identifiable?
Identifiable. The difference between organic and biological? That's a good question. That's a really big question.
Because
Yeah.
when we talk about the 19th century use of the ornament and the Alberti's description of the building as animal, I guess that suggests the building mainly as organism in the sense of
An organized set of functions,
a
yeah.
well-balanced system. But when you explain the biological as a system in which there is a constant mutation of information between an external and internal milieu, I mean, that is not really an organism.
That's right. Or it's an open organism, an organism without a kind of a closure. That's right. That it's an open organism. That's right. And I think that's what's happening in genetics, is I think the organism has opened. Not literally, maybe we don't, but it's now open for excavation. It's been thrown open. And so and that's partly why the whole concept of species is now irrelevant, and and all sorts of